Mark Clark, follow package, because of course the Aaron'sburg collection is the jewel of the PMA. And I want to mention Mark's next project, which is a reconstruction of the exhibition held in the Copley Gallery. And that will be an absolutely fascinating exploration. And I know he will be relying on the resources of the next speaker to complete it. Um, Anne Helmreich is the director of the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institute. And I can tell you, from my experience as a Smithsonian Fellow to now, the growth in scope, holdings, and inquiry and activity that the archives have experienced is tremendous. We have been very fortunate to have a relationship with the archives in the past, which we are committed to rekindling now, because again, all entities that are committed to American art, we hope to bring them together and create a partnership, and we're honored to do that. So Anne Helmreich is the director of the Smithsonian's Archives, and she is here today and very kindly titled her talk Boundless Horizons at the Archives of American Art. You can start.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Is that working? Great. So I want to Brian, I think helped foster this connection. And absolutely, Lisa, we are deeply committed to this rekindling. And to pick up on your point about synchronicity, if anybody wants to look at the papers of Catherine Koo, come to the Archives of American Art, where they're located. So we're just delighted, I'm delighted to be here. In keeping with the theme of Boundless Horizons and the fact that we haven't been as present at this conference in recent years, Lisa suggested to me that I give you more of an overview today of what the archives is, what we do in some of our recent activities. When I'm wearing my scholar's hat, I am a scholar of the art market, and I'm working on a book on the rise of the commercial art gallery in New York in the 19th and early 20th century. So if you want to have your head chopped off, come find me and talk to me about that. I want to begin by just sort of picking up on the theme. I'm hoping that maybe there's yes. Picking up on this theme of Boundless Horizon, and also what Kathleen was saying this morning in the earlier talk. In 2024, we revitalized our mission statement. If you're not aware, the Archives of American Art was founded in 1954 at the Detroit Institute of Art. And that core function that we established then, collecting, preserving, making available, has remained the same. But we never answered the question, why? Why does it matter that we do this? So in our new mission statement, we tried to help answer that question, why? And that answer is to empower an expansive history of American art. And it may be we should make that history plural. In other words, to Kathleen's point that there are so many different histories. So we want to be an archive that isn't just supporting one narrative, but the many narratives that make up American art. So as I said, we were founded in 1954 at the Detroit Institute of Art. Forgive me if you've heard this founding story before, but it was a brainchild of two individuals, which I think actually, Lisa, is a wonderful sort of metaphor for this gathering today. The then director of the Detroit Institute of Art, Edgar P. Richardson, whose History of American Art is on the left, and then a businessman who goes on to become, the director of the Kennedy Galleries, but at this point was a businessman in Detroit, Lawrence Fleischman, who you see on the right. And the story goes, Richardson had just signed the contract for the book on American painting. Fleischman had just bought a painting in Thomas Unsch's painting. They have lunch together. Richardson says, where am I going to find all the materials to write this history of American art? Fleischman says, I want to learn more about Anschutz. Where do I go to do that? And the two of them cooked up the idea of the Archives of American Art. That is to kind of create a one-stop shopping, if you will, one destination for all the primary source documents relating to American art. We're not going to collect art itself, but all the documents, the documentation relating to the making of a work of art, to artist sketchbooks, diaries, correspondence, as well as the documentation around the display, circulation of that work of art. So art collectors, art galleries, art organizations. And I'm going to unpack for you a little bit later some of the strengths of our collection. And this is the interesting point, and I love reading this old correspondence. They're like, we are going to use cutting edge technology to do this, which was microfilm, 1954. So they have this idea, and this is, for example, how the Copley papers are with the archives. They would go out on collecting campaigns and photograph everything, but either leave it in situ, so we have New York Public Library things on microfilm, or return it to the owner, Copley material. So those 7,000, over 7,000 reels of microfilm are what the result of that campaign. People often ask, how did we decide, and how do we decide today what should be collected? We have a really crisp definition, long-term research value. Long-term research value. That takes a little bit of a crystal globe. We hope that we're getting it right. We hope that we're ahead of the curve, but it really needs a lot of listening to people like you. What do you all think is coming up? So that we're not just following, but we're looking ahead as well. This quote from William Wolfenden, who was an early director of the archives, I think still holds true for us. We want to have both breadth and depth. So he talks about collecting widely, how important that is, but also to have a depth of collecting. We particularly like to build nodes. If we have one particular artist's papers, we know they were part of a network to try and build out that network. And I love it. We had a Sam fellow last year who said to me, hey, I read a letter by an artist, and then I discovered you have the papers of the, I could read the other half of the letter, and that's the point. So that kind of experience of discovery is what we want people to have, and as Wolfenden said, it makes the total so important. So in terms of our collecting in the early years, and thinking about this notion of boundless horizons, I wouldn't say we were boundless because we thought of a lot of collecting through geographies. So they were based in Detroit, and then over time they built up a network of regional offices. So one in New York in 1960, when they joined the Smithsonian in 1970, that established the Washington, D.C. office. They had an office in Boston, and then two offices on the West Coast, one in San Francisco and one in Los Angeles, in the Huntington. If you know the Virginia Scott Gallery, our offices used to be there. That office in the Huntington was the last regional office that closed in 2005. So they had that model of regional offices, but by 2005, due to some funding changes and also the recognition that, we have planes, trains, automobiles, that maybe we could still have a national reach without having separate offices. And then we also did collecting drives in cities, and I'm not listing every single one here, but we did a big one in Chicago, a big one in Philadelphia, and we were in Texas with a heavy-duty collecting drive from 1979 to 1985. So even if a regional wasn't represented to a regional office, we would do these kind of collecting drives. So as I said, this resulted in over 7,000 microfilm reels. One set is with us, and of course some backup, but then we also created this network of research affiliates. So you can be, for example, in Los Angeles, and see those microfilms because they're housed at the Huntington Library. If you're in Texas, you can go to the Amon Carter Museum. In San Francisco, the DeYoung, and here in New York, our New York office used to host them, but some of you may know the Frick Museum has refurbished their library, and they agreed to take our microfilm, which is far better for all of you because they have longer library hours than what we used to be able to offer. So if you're not aware yet, we didn't make a big public splash about this, but the microfilms that used to be in our New York office are now at the Frick, and they are happy to serve as you there. Now, over time, we also began to collect original materials. And one of the first set of original materials that came to us were the Macbeth Gallery records. Those were in the late 60s. By the early 2000s, we had really tipped over into majority collecting original materials and minority, if you will, microfilm. And we really stopped the microfilm program. We only collect original materials now. One of the benefits of collecting original materials is we now have an exhibition loan program. So if we have an original document, we are happy to consider loaning it to exhibitions. Those of you here in New York that may have seen the Ben Shahn exhibition at the Jewish Museum, we were the largest lender to that exhibition by virtue of the number of photographs that they included in that exhibition. Speaking of Duchamp, if you go to the Duchamp exhibition, you will see a letter by Marcel Duchamp to his sister, the first written reference we know of to a ready-made, which comes from our papers, which is a nice way to also point out that our notion of American art, like we were talking before, is boundless in that we don't say you must have a U.S. passport or be a U.S. citizen to be in the archive. It is, did the activity impact the U.S.? Did it unfold in the U.S.? So this letter from Duchamp, he spent time here. This was a letter written to his sister. His sister's husband was also an artist who ends up in his last years here in the U.S. So his papers come to us, and by that, the sister's papers come to us. So here's just a little more plug for our documents touring in on loan programs. So any of you involved with exhibitions, if you're interested, again, we are more than happy to entertain requests. And speaking of pre-Columbian, we've loaned materials for the exhibition that will be opening in June at the Getty on Earl Stendhal, the collector of pre-Columbian art, who also sold American Surrealists. So who are we today? We have more than 30 million items in our collection. We are also the largest oral history program devoted to American art. The oral history program began in 1958, just a few years after we started, with somebody having the very prescient realization, 1958, the WPA was one of the largest collecting creation moments, and that generation in 1958, they were ready. They were in different phases of their careers. So we collected over 300 oral histories from WPA artists, and that started the program, which is ongoing ever since. So we're really delighted with that program. We serve millions of people around the globe. We know this from our website, and we're going to talk a little bit more about our digitization program. And we're really committed on things like collecting widely to preserve and make available the unique stories of American art. In terms of our audiences, I think our key audiences are probably their art world professionals, curators. We're also moving more and more into the education space. We've been running the Teaching the Primary Sources program, and we're really trying to develop and help reach those who are arts curious, or the arts enthusiasts. So I hope we can join with you in helping to cultivate an interest and curiosity about American art. So I want to now do a little bit of a deep dive on our collecting strengths. It is hard. We do say no to things. And I say this with all great gratitude in my heart. My husband's an artist. No. He's had a great career, but he hasn't had a career, so we'll talk about that later. Love the man. Fantastic. But one of our great collecting strengths is lives of artists. That seems rather obvious, and it's one core thing in our oral history program relates heavily to that. We have just received the papers of Robert Indiana. They're being cataloged. If you want to use them, you're welcome to it. It's a bit of a needle in the haystack. They arrived in over 150 boxes, stencils, everything you can imagine to use to make works of art. We also, if we don't have the papers of an artist, they often show up in our collections, somebody like Mark Rosso or Imogen Cunningham. And we have materials going back to the early Republic. So I brought in this copy letters to Humphrey. As I said, our oral history program is one of our key strengths. Founded in 1958, we have oral histories of artists, collectors, and other figures. We have nearly 3,000 today. And one of the ways we're trying to get them back out in the world is through our podcast. If you've never listened to one of our oral histories, make a big pot of coffee or tea, because they're like 8 to 12 hours long. We invite people to do their full life history. We create a transcript that they get to read. We put that transcript on our website. We would kill our website if we put the full 12 hours, like buffering and downloading it, because you get to the transcript. But we've been thinking about who's going to listen to the 12 hours? So we have such great snippets in there. That's what we've been doing in our podcast. Pick a theme, and then we pull out different voices and read them together in the podcast. And then we've also published, as in this book, selections from our oral history program. Another collecting strength is research and writing about art. And I'm looking at Wanda here. So these are art historians, critics, curators, and we are honored to have their papers. So we have the papers of Clement Greenberg, Patricia Hills, Laurie Sims, Wanda. So these are people who shape the narrative and who have been so generous to share their research files with us for future generations. We also collect arts organizations. For example, we have the papers of the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, which I'll come back to digitized as an institution. They no longer have their own records, and we felt like it's really important for their curators to be able to access their own history. The image on the right, sorry, the label doesn't come out. It doesn't have to be sort of a big official organization. This is Four Walls, this scrappy gallery that was here in Williamsburg and Brooklyn for a while. And so we collected their papers. So just giving you the range of what we mean by arts organization. One of our biggest areas of our collection by physical size is the art market. And that is because the papers of dealers are so vast. Leo Castelli is 250 papers on our office and another 250 in an off-site storage. So just Castelli alone is huge. But again, our papers for dealers, you do not have to have been a dealer of American art. We have the papers of Jacques Seligman, who had a New York gallery as well as a Paris gallery. And those papers we've also digitized because he was active during World War II. You may know that as sailing the Suez, they were forced to shut down the Paris branch. So to help those families looking for histories of objects, we digitized those papers because there's correspondence and how they were dealing with some of the objects coming through Europe. This is a shout out to Marty in the upper right. This is the Outlines Gallery in Pittsburgh, woman-owned gallery backed by Edgar Kaufman that brought modernism to Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, so this is also my hometown shout out. She put together this fabulous scrapbook where you see her painting the gallery before she sets it up, and so it's a really wonderful story about somebody who really put her heart and soul into her project. And then Virginia Dwan, just to indicate that we go from the east to the west coast in our gallery collection. Another key collecting strength is patronage. Art collectors, which range from the 19th century, somebody like Samuel P. Shaw, to, as I said, the Federal Arts Project, thinking about that endeavor as a patronage project. And then we have the papers of George and Herbert Vogel, as you know, gave their work to the National Gallery of Art. We also do art instruction and services. Doesn't that sound very clinical? But it's art schools. This is an image on the left from Haystack. We have a lot of material related to Haystack, for example. And this, sorry, the label's gone on this. This is Court Fabrication Services. They did a lot of work with Klaus Oldenburg, other people. So we think it's really important to collect those, particularly for conservators. You want to know how those fabricators made things if you have to undertake conservation. So we're trying to think about what are the needs of the arts ecosystem to be able to do the kind of work people need to be able to do. So flipping to what Lisa asked me also to touch on, which is some of our recent collecting initiatives. Um, we do periodic assessments of our collection. Where are the gaps? Where are the absences? Where could we build out more strongly? And I've only been there 3 years, so I can take no credit for this, but in the early 2000s, well, actually even going back to the late 1990s, they started an assessment thinking that they had not done enough work around women artists. So one of the earliest ways they addressed that was through an oral history project, expanding the oral history narratives with women artists. Then they had collected from an initiative that had been in 1977, where people had been asked to respond to a survey, what is feminist art? So they reissued that survey in 2019, collecting those responses, understanding what the difference between what people thought of in 77 versus what people thought in 2019 for feminist art. And then today, we are still continuing to work on women artists. As you may know, the Smithsonian will have a Women's History Museum eventually, so we're working in tandem with them to help identify the role of women in the arts ecosystem. And then I want to give a shout out to the Judith Godwin Foundation, who's been helping us process and digitize the papers of women artists to try and get them more available and accessible. Another major initiative we've been doing, thanks to my colleague Josh P. Franco, is with Latinx art. Now, we had begun this work in the mid-1990s, coming out of the work that had happened in Texas, also in California and Florida, with a lot of oral histories with Latino artists. We've seen this trend where we sort of start with the oral histories and then we move to papers. And then by 2015, we realized we really needed somebody who was dedicated on the team to collecting in this area, and brought Josh onto the team with a funding initiative. So I want to say a little bit more about when we have an initiative. It doesn't mean we stop collecting in that area when the initiative's over. What the initiative typically allows us to fund is putting together advisory committees so that we can consult with the field. It allows us to put special funding into processing the archive so when things come in, we can have them available to researchers very quickly. So we had special for a 2-year period to put an initiative, and it's ongoing. So Josh is still with us, and I would say his portfolio is about 50% Latino collecting. And Josh wrote a wonderful piece with Santa Kupla that kind of covers his early years of collecting that material at the archive. We've also had an African American collecting initiative. Shout out to the Leaf Foundation. They helped fund this in 2017. Again, helped fund putting together an advisory committee, special travel costs, processing, and the 3 collections you see here all came in during that initiative. Senda Nagudi, Beverly Buchanan, and Amish Thomas. And we realized how important this is. The Beverly Buchanan materials, for example, we've only seen an escalation of a number of requests to borrow those materials for exhibitions. So again, if you have it and you make it available, then the world can start to build those stories around it. And again, this is an ongoing collecting initiative. As some of you may know, Dominic Lester, who works at the Carnegie on the Senior Harris Archive, he's helping us with this collecting initiative. And I just love the Beverly Buchanan stuff. I had to add it. And I think it goes to the fact that these papers aren't just telling you about the lives of these artists, but they also are a little insight into the art world ecosystem in which these people were intersecting and moving through. Joyce Scott, that you'll be hearing from, she's given her papers to us as well as an oral history, so another outcome, and it's terrific. We can support, Amish Thomas from Washington, D.C., Joyce from Baltimore. So again, we collect nationally, but we also make sure we take care of our sort of hometown regions. We've also recently begun or reinvigorated an initiative on Asian American art. We had done some work in the 1980s in the Northwest region with Leaf Foundation funding. And in 2024, we relaunched the initiative, but as a nationwide initiative. And I'll tell you, one of the things we realized in doing this, one of our gaps, we have very few materials from Hawaii. So we've been really spending a lot of time in Hawaii, getting to know those communities. Again, this special collecting initiative allows us to bring communities together to help advise us on the collection. And this has also been really important for craft. I show you Roger Shimamura. His papers are with us, and he has a wonderful practice of an ongoing donation of journals. When he's done with them, he donates them to us. So if you're a fan of his work, stay tuned because his collections are constantly with us, are constantly growing. And then this is Hung Lu. Her papers just arrived with us in September, and they're being processed right now. So again, we can make those more easily available to people by the end of that processing period. We've also done a number of special projects in our oral history area. Again, I'm sorry these labels aren't coming through, but the far left comes from a special project we did with support from the Keith Haring Foundation on AIDS in the visual arts. And those oral histories, we also deposited a J store, which is used by a lot of teaching institutions, and they have a major kind of collection of teaching materials related to AIDS. The middle image is from a project we did during the pandemic of shorter oral histories asking artists how were you impacted by the pandemic. Thinking again, 50 years from now, those might be stories that people want. Even if today I read them and I still get really, a little bit traumatized from that. And then the far right, with funding from the Leon Pope Smith Foundation, we've done an initiative to collect the oral histories of Indigenous artists, and we've had a renewal of that grant, so expanding that program. Another area in which we're thinking a lot is computer art. We had a computer art study day in 2023 to launch this initiative. And one of the things that was interesting, we thought, we don't have that much on computer art. But in fact, we already did. We had, for example, the paper that Frederick Hammersley, who in the 60s, when he was teaching at University of New Mexico, got exposed to an IBM Fortran computer, IBM computer using Fortran, and used punch cards, and I'm sorry it doesn't reproduce well, but to create these computer drawings. So one of the things we've been doing, working with curators from LACMA and other places, is try to actually reconstruct the history. And I was just talking to Garth about this because we have the papers, the curator who we believe created the first museum exhibition devoted to computer art at the place of Everson in Jersey. And then it sort of feels funny to say recent initiative craft because we've always collected in this area, but we're rejuvenating in this. Some of you may know we had major funding in the early 2000s to do a big collecting project related to craft. And it brought in so many oral histories and papers. But again, it's sort of a dirty little secret. We had money to collect, but we didn't have money to process. And those are two steps. Collect to bring in, process to create a little roadmap for somebody to know what you have. So we're trying to address that. And again, thank you, Luce Foundation. They've given us funding to process some of those papers, including the papers of the curator Paul Smith, who some of you may know from the Museum of Art and Design, did some of the first major exhibitions, one-person retrospectives. And then we will be doing our own for the 250. Our project will focus on those craft histories, and we're going to do a 3-part project. Our gallery in Washington, D.C. will be devoted to craft history, coming alongside the major projects that will be at the Renwick on American craft. We will also do a podcast with Glenn Adamson as our Sarah Archer, as our curators of our oral histories. And then we're going to try for the first time a new computer interface to our craft collection based on a map. And this is with the supposition that those people who are enthusiastic or curious about craft sometimes don't know the names of artists, but they may know a region or a medium in which they're interested in. So would a map be helpful? So we'll try this out as an experiment. We're also doing a new project with the Tashiko Takahashi Foundation. We're going to do an oral history initiative with them. Some of you may know that we worked with a lot of studio assistants on some very complicated recipes for creating And we alongside the foundation, we're like, we need to capture those histories of making before that cadre of studio assistants is no longer with us. So I've talked a lot about collecting. I want to just touch briefly on access before I wrap up. We, as I said, were founded on this idea of microfilm. That was cutting edge technology in 1954. That's not cutting edge technology now. And in 2000, we got a major endowment from the Terra Foundation. And this was a game changer. I will say this changed the DNA of the organization, which was to digitize the papers. So it's a huge workflow, but we are so proud of what we accomplished. And I cannot tell you the number of people who say to me, I was working, I got notes. I was working in France, Poland. I'm interested in American art. If we want American art to be studied overseas, this is huge. This is absolutely huge. And I also get it. Not everyone can afford a train, plane, automobile trip to Washington, D.C. So this also reduces that geography hurdle to accessing our papers. So the Terra Foundation made this possible. And then we had a second lift from the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, who came in and said, this is great. The Terra money was for materials that were considered central to the narrative of American art. It was an interesting phrasing. Lichtenstein came in and said, let's go for those underrepresented artists, those voices who haven't been heard from as much. So they provided special funding that allows us to digitize those papers of people who have not been in those textbooks up to now. And that's been a huge game changer. And I will also add a plug right now. If any of you are interested in something, can't come to Washington, D.C., for a modest fee, I know I sound like a salesperson, but for a modest fee, you can pay for a folder to be digitized. You may be only after one letter, but it takes so much effort just to get that one letter out. We just digitize the whole folder. You may get a bonanza of 100 letters for that one you wanted. But I know you're paying for it, but once you do it, we put it on the website. So you're paying it forward. Somebody else will be able to use that. And really, we are actually able to make a lot of progress to people's individual demands. So that we have sort of three workflows: the Terra, the Lichtenstein, and then your request from the field. We are really building a digital repository. I will say we have about 10% of our holdings digitized. My board always says, when will you be done? I'm like, well, so remember when I told you when the Robert, Indiana papers just came in? That was 160 boxes. Like, in other words, we'll never be done. Boundless horizons, because we're always bringing material in. So frankly, I think we'll stay lucky at 10%. But I think we're doing a pretty good job. So what are we thinking about for the future? Born digital. How do we preserve the born digital? I bet many of you have seen David Hockney's iPad. What's the sketchbook of the future? It's going to be on the hard drive. What's the correspondence of the future? It's going to be email. So we are thinking hard about how to preserve that born digital record. I don't want to make it too much big buzzers out there, but there are computer programs that allow us to harvest emails and things like that, but it's a constantly changing landscape. And I want to give another shout out to the Lichtenstein Foundation, who recognized this changing landscape and just gave us a major gift to bring on two experts in born digital. One will be on the archives, how do we get this into our system, and the other person is going to go out, talk to artists endowed foundations, what computer programs we're using, what are formats, what are the challenges, that we can be set up to collect for the future, which may be more and more digital and less paper-based. So that's it for me. That's an overview of the archive, and thank you so much. And really, I know all of you in this room are probably users, so thank you very much. If the material isn't used, what's the point of collecting it? So really, thank you for all of you for being users of the archive. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. So Heritage is graciously providing lunch. However, we're going to need to have a little swap out of what's there for this array of sandwiches and such that are coming. So it may be 5 or 10 minutes lapse. Okay, that's Erin, and she's in charge. um, anyway, so 12:30, and I think that's a really lovely addition because it allows us all to continue conversing. Now I'm going to give the mic back to Ann, and she can take whatever questions there are.
Well, when I'm between you and lunch. Yes, please. Please, Stephen.
I'm assuming this is a question you don't want to discuss.
Play on.
How have the cuts that have been so evident in the second Trump administration affected your work?
Yeah. No, I don't mind answering. I honestly don't mind answering at all. It's it's a it's an interesting moment. I will say, some people who know my background, I came from the Getty to the Smithsonian. So some of my friends joke, and you went from the most well-funded arts organization to this kind of scrappy. But what's really interesting, so, and I am learning so much that I'm a kid who grew up on Schoolhouse Rock. Remember, the bill goes up on Capitol Hill? Man, am I learning? There's a lot more that happened before that bill. So the archives and the Smithsonian overall are not an executive branch agency. So we're different than the Kennedy Center, we're different than the National Gallery, and we're different from the Library of Congress. So we're what's called the trust instrumentality of the United States. Did I ever know what that meant? So it goes back. Do you all know this story? I should advance because we're waiting for lunch. James Smithson, who the Smithsonian is named for, was, sorry, polite company, the bastard son of British nobility. And if you all know your Jane Austen, he cannot inherit, right? Because he is not legitimate. Man makes his fortune in the Industrial Revolution. When he goes to settle his estate, has never been to the United States, but says that country believes in meritocracy. They're getting all my money. So he left his entire estate to the United States government to benefit and advance for the increase in diffusion of knowledge. So then the U.S. Congress decides to create the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian, from its very inception, becomes this trust instrumentality funded by Smithson. And the idea is it's a private-public partnership. We have Smithson core funds, which become an endowment that grew over time, and was added private money to it. So we have these endowments from Karen Lichtenstein. And then a public enterprise where Congress apportions us funds. So this is a long-winded response to your question. True confession, when the president set forward his budget to Congress, the Smithsonian was pretty heavily cut. Congress approved our budget at the same funding level as last year. I don't know what, that's good news and it's bad news. I still gotta pay people's salaries and promotions, cost of living goes up. So a flat budget doesn't cover everything, but it's not a cut either. What's gonna happen this fall? I don't know. But the other thing I will say, and people heard me say this, a big shout out to Lonnie Bunch, because he just says the same thing. We are an independent agency, we're in charge of our own content, and, our money comes from Congress, the White House doesn't tell us what to do. It's just being recorded pretty long. So have I answered your question?
The answer is yes. But there is still a danger associated with the non-James Smithson trust funds. in the sense that Congress could stop that funding. And I don't know the percentage divide between Smithson Trust funds and government appropriations, but I'm sure there is a percentage.
So I'll be really transparent. We're a public institution. I will tell you, the majority of the Smithsonian, it's 60-40. 60 federal, 40 private. We're the opposite. 60 private, 40 federal. So, yeah. So I would, yeah, it would be hard. It would be really hard. And I think as an institution, there are choices we really hope we don't have to make. I never want to have to charge. Our reading room is open free to the public. You make an appointment, we digitize that material, we put it online. We just charge modest fees for that digitization on demand because somebody wants it within 6 to 8 weeks. So I hope we never have to go where we have to, charge admission. As you know, all our museums are free. We're open 7 days a week. I hope we never get to a place where we have to reduce a day being open. But yeah, so yeah, I hope we don't have to make those hard choices. But yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm happy to be transparent because we're a public institution and you all, through your tax dollars, are helping to support us. So. Yeah, wonderful.
Very handy. And tomorrow when I give a talk, I'm going to talk about a whole class of rip-offs or something of the American Gothic that are born digital. So since you have the time, tell us a little bit more. If you get a scrapbook that is only basically a computer of sketches, how do you save them?
Yeah.
Given that most of my former lectures from 15 years ago now come with these little black boxes that say exec or something on them and can no longer be recovered.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the Born Digital Catalog.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I love thinking about these things, and this is where it's a real pro to be part of the Smithsonian. So, I mean, I'm sure you've all had that black floppy disk in a little plastic case, and like computer can't do that. So, born digital refers to materials that were born in a digital format, not paper turned into digital, but were created using digital computer tools. So one thing is we at the Smithsonian have a whole host of machines, software to be able to recover those things. Then we try to recover them and we create what we call a surrogate, access surrogate version. We want to keep the original, but we want to be able to, we don't want to serve that up in the reading room because then what if somebody's like, Cindy. So we keep the original, but we create a surrogate that is compatible with today's technology that we can serve it into the reading room, or however way we're going to serve it. So we need both the technology to do the forensics, basically. We have a big forensics workstation. So we do the forensics, and then we have to create the access copy for it. But like Fred Hammersley, we have the records of the foundation. And they never produced a catalog resume, but they produced a major database of all known locations for his paintings, as well as photographs. They did that all digitally. So that, and then that we make sure that we keep that database original, and then we keep periodically recycle through it, like open it up in Excel, make it compatible so somebody can keep using it, because it's what's the point of saving it if no one can access it. So that's it's huge. I think where we're running into problems, I'll be really transparent. We've had some artists say to us, we want you to preserve our Instagram account. I think of Instagram as where I curated my space, but that's a third-party proprietary platform. So that's where we really are going to need some help. That's why we decided to hire 2 people, like one person who can maybe go do some of those negotiations. Like, how do we work with proprietary materials or proprietary platforms? That, this, non-proprietary, but when it's sitting inside a kind of digital lockbox, that to me is the biggest challenge, is the way we all put parts of our lives into these vault that we access them only like through a password, and somebody else has all the software and everything running that. So that, to me, is going to be the biggest challenge. And it may be just working with some of these artists, and it may change how we work. Like, we can work today with a family who inherits, an estate from an artist. It may be, if an artist wants us to save their digital footprint, that we have to work with them while they're living so that we can access those things with their permission and then, download them into a more stable format. So, yeah, I think it's exciting, but I don't think it's going to be simple. Yeah, right. Yeah. And their archival training programs are just now generating people with degrees in born digital. So yeah, so we're gonna hire a born digital archivist, and then we're hiring what we're calling a born digital strategist. And that strategist is the one who's gonna kind of do these surveys of what platforms are people using, where are we just, that third party is just gonna always shut us down, or where can we make some advances? So yeah, yeah, Andrew.
One is how big is your staff?
Yeah, we're snidey. We're small and mighty. We have 38 staff members, so we're a collection of 30 million items. So yeah,
Well, and I know within that lane that you drive, most um, forcefully, there are many cultural institutions, museums, et cetera, that also support archives who are dealing with many of
yeah.
the same issues around preservation, I guess, in this new world that we live in. Do you serve as a thought leader in that as well? Do you help train or make your resources available to archival
Right.
groups across the country?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so again, like in that spirit of transparency, all our guidelines for how we treat and care for materials, we make them publicly available. And we certainly get inquiries all the time and point them to them. And, we may, in some cases, we may not be the right home for an artist's papers, but we're happy. I mean, I just went to visit an artist estate in Baltimore. They want to care for themselves, love it. And, that's their choice. But then how can we be helpful in that based on, for example, because we have a reading room and we see so many people come through what researchers tend to want to have access to, we can say to an artist estate, here are the kinds of things I would really suggest you save based on what we see people being most interested in. And if you have to make choices, maybe this is what you decide to maybe set aside or think about later and really prioritize over here. Yeah, and then we're constantly going to conferences and things like that. But yeah, I think, overall, we're not going to be able to do this work alone. We do it in collaboration, and I think sometimes I'd like to have I have to write, somebody's approached us with a collection, but we know the majority of the collection is already with another institution. I'm going to write back and say, please, yeah, exactly. It's better that it stays together than it be split up. So we really try to be respectful of our colleagues in that way too. Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Christina. We've only zoomed. This is a 3D moment. So for the regional collectors, thank you. We have one person based on the West Coast, and then we have a person based here. Their remit is specifically because of their endowed positions, so the way the endowment's set up. And then everyone else on the collection team is national. For our oral history team, we have one oral historian, and then we have one archivist that supports them. And then we're about to hire a coordinator. Because one of the things we realize that's the most difficult. One of the things I love about our oral history program is we negotiate with whoever's going to be interviewed to say, who would you like to have as your person to interview you? But then it's like, planning a wedding, like coordinating schedules. So we've added that person to the team. So, yeah.
to digital, understanding that that's in our future. But do you have thought leaders that actually try to forecast things that 100 years from now people might want to be preserved that we right now don't feel like this is how AI improves society, something like that. Something that is just starting but has not been established as a historical point that can be significant.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it gets to, we select because we think it'll have long-term research value, but it's, yeah, you're playing a kind of, yeah, crystal ball game. So I think a lot of it is we just try to listen to the field and talk to people. I try to go to as many conferences, have my team go to conferences, and just, what do you think is ask, what do you think is bubbling up? So if you see me typing my iPad today and tomorrow, I'm thinking about that constantly. I also think our museum colleagues, what do they think, what would you want for an exhibition? What are ideas you're thinking about? And then AI, boy, that's, I think it has some really wonderful promise for us, but, could it help us find topics inside of our oral history program? At the same time, we've been dealing with people contacting us saying we have something that we do not have because ChatGPT made it up. So I also worry about that. I mean, I literally spent 45 minutes with a woman from France who had a painting with a gallery label on the back, and she swore that we had those gallery records. And we didn't. And when I finally had her replicate her search, she had done it with ChatGPT. So, yes, it could bring us some exciting new frontiers in our Boundless Horizon conversation, but there's also places where I think we have to be really cautious.
Have just time to hang out, talk to the person next to you. If you know them, hug them, and if you don't, shake hands and get to know them. Um, this is, we will have lunch coming in 15 minutes, and honestly, as one of my professors used to say, this is God-given time. So please enjoy it. And we are so thrilled to have each one of you here. And I see in the back, Lowry Sims and Joy Scott. And I want to refer back to Kathy's talk about cross media, um, thinking about beyond the conventional notion, restricted notion of what is quote unquote art. And so we're so honored that they are going to be on the program this afternoon. Um, Something I've dreamed of for years. So anyway, please savor the moment. We look forward to having lunch with you and to a robust afternoon.